All right, so we're picking back up with this idea of looking at more than one characteristic at a time. And we're going to be using some fancy mathematics instead of creating very large Punnett squares in order to take a look at the probability of certain characteristics in offspring given parent genotypes. So before we move on, we need to talk about two wonderful mathematic rules that we can use to our advantage to determine these multi-hybrid cross probabilities. We've already really done some of these, and really intuitively both of these rules of addition and rule of multiplication when we did our Punnett square. So for instance, if this sperm crosses with this egg, being as though there's a half a chance, 1 out of 2, as we can see here, of a dominant allele sperm, and half a chance here for a dominant allele egg, 1/2 times 1/2, that's a quarter of a chance, 1/4 of a chance that we'll have this offspring, homozygous dominant. And then the same for the one down here, half a chance for the homozygous dominant, or I'm sorry, for the dominant allele, and half a chance for the recessive allele, a quarter of a chance for this organism here being heterozygous. Now as we look around the Punnett square, we can see that there are two offspring that are heterozygous. So there is a quarter chance for a homozygous dominant, a quarter chance for a homozygous recessive, and we would say a 1/4 plus a 1/4 chance of a heterozygote. So we have half a chance. 2 out of the 4 offspring possibilities will be heterozygote. So that is the rule of addition. We did the rule of multiplication here to get our offspring genotypes. And we do the rule of addition if we have more than one type of genotype that is the same, for instance here for heterozygote, or more than one genotype that produces a particular phenotype, as we'll see in our examples for multi-hybrid crosses. And we can also do that here as well for phenotypes. So these organisms will have the dominant phenotype. So there would be a 75% chance, or a 3/4 chance, of having the dominant phenotype and a 1/4 chance of the recessive phenotype. All right. So you've already really used that mathematical magic of the rule of multiplication and the rule of addition. Now with this multi-hybrid or multi-character cross, you're going to want to take a look at the assignment for this week, because in the assignment this particular example is outlined. So for the chapter on meiosis, this particular series of questions and this example is shown there. So you might want to pause this video and take a look at that and make some notes as we move through. So when you're looking at a multi-character cross, you have 2 or more characteristics you're looking at, and you want to treat them all as independent monohybrid crosses. So you're only going to be doing Punnett squares that are 4 squares each. So for instance here, we'll take a look at 3 characteristics at the same time. So we have an organism, a parent organism that has purple flowers, yellow seeds that are round. Okay, and then we have another flower, another parent that has purple flowers, but the seeds are green and they are wrinkled. Okay, so we have our genotypes for the parents listed here, are shown here, and we have heterozygous for each of these characters in one parent, heterozygous for the flowers, and then homozygous recessive for the other characteristics in this parent. So there'll be a question, for instance here, what percentage of the offspring from the cross are predicted to have purple flowers, green, and wrinkled seeds? Okay, so before we get to that particular question, you want to consider each character separately. Do a separate Punnett square for each character. So for the flower color, the seed color, the seed shape, and you should get these results when you do your Punnett squares. So you physically want to do your Punnett squares. Now, I cannot tell you this enough. I really can't emphasize this enough. You must take your time on these Punnett squares and get these numbers correct. If you don't do that, everything else will be wrong in your answer. So you must take the time and do this. So you have these particular frequencies of these genotypes in the offspring for each of the characters. And then we go back to that question. So that's what we had in the last slide as far as the frequencies. And I'll give you these genotypes. So these are the genotypes that satisfied this question. So I would ask you, what's the chance of, getting purple flowers? They both have purple flowers. Green and wrinkled seeds. They'll both have green and wrinkled seeds. So what's the chance of these two genotypes? Okay. So what we do is we take those two genotypes, and I think, this should be an uppercase P. Yikes. But in any case, we take these genotypes and we say, okay, well, what's the chance of heterozygote? We look up here, 1/2. Multiply that by the chance of having the seed color, green. We put that 1/2 chance. We see that from up here. And then this one here, what's the chance of having the wrinkled genotype? 1/2 chance. So the chance of having purple flowers, green seeds that are wrinkled, 1/2 times 1/2, that's 1/4, times 1/2, okay? That's 1/8. I know it's 1/8, but I have it written this way for a particular reason. You'll see why. Okay. Oh, there's our uppercase P. It came back. So the chance of uppercase P homozygous dominant is 1/4, and then 1/2 for the green and wrinkled seeds. 1/4 times 1/2, 1/8 times 1/2 is 1/16. And we want to add these two together. So remember, this is 1/8, but I want to add them together. Whenever you add fractions, you have to have the same denominator. I know, 3rd grade. This is a long time ago. But in any case, 1/16 plus 2/16, 3/16. So that is your final answer. All of that for that one final answer. So again, using the rule of multiplication, rule of addition, to solve these multi-hybrid cross problems. So please do not make a ginormous Punnett square to solve problems where you're looking at more than one characteristic in the offspring. Now there's another example just like this in the assignment, so take a look at that, and the PowerPoint slides for that example are also in the main PowerPoint for the chapter. All right, so there are other more complex inheritance patterns than the complete dominance we talked about with Mendel. So take a look at codominance, incomplete dominance, and multiple alleles. All of Mendel's fundamental laws do still apply. So we just see a different kind of inheritance pattern based on the different types of organisms and what exactly is going on with the alleles. So there's a really great example of each of these inheritance patterns in the main PowerPoint, and they're described in detail in the chapter. So take a look at those. So the final thing we'll talk about here is something called pedigree analysis. So looking at the inheritance in human populations to try to determine genotype probabilities. Okay? Because we can't necessarily, artificially create matings between two human people. That would just be unethical. So we do this instead to get a good approximation of a possibility of having a particular trait. So for instance, just to orient you to the pedigree, circles are always for females, squares are always for males. The dominant alleles, of course, recessive alleles, that's all remains the same. A horizontal line indicates mating. A vertical line down to another horizontal line with offspring indicate the offspring of that particular mating. And these would all be brothers and sisters, okay? And then these two individuals married and had these two lovely young ladies down here. And we're looking at a trait called a widow's peak. Whatever trait we're looking at is going to be filled in. So if filled in circular square. So if the individual has the trait, it'll be a filled in circular square. So just looking at this inheritance pattern, this is a dominant inheritance pattern, meaning that you have to have at least one dominant allele in order to have the trait. So you have to have at least one dominant allele to have a widow's peak. So a widow's peak is this kind of V-like arrangement of the hair, whereas this young lady unfortunately does not have that. This is actually considered very beautiful in Japan. I actually have somewhat of a widow's peak. I want to go to there. One day, we'll see. But in any case, we're looking at the widow's peak. So it looks like the father had a widow's peak. He passed on that trait to his daughter here, his son. And then on this side of the family, the mom had the widow's peak, passed it on to her daughter. Both of these individuals had the widow's peak. But the parents passed on the trait to her one daughter, but not the other. We know what her genotype is for sure. She doesn't have a widow's peak, so she has to be homozygous recessive. Now, this young lady over here, we are not sure. She could be homozygous dominant or she could be heterozygous. Because remember, you only need one allele to have a widow's peak. So usually what you do is you fill in what you know from the information given. If it's a dominantly inherited characteristic, you would go around to all of the circles or squares that are not filled in and put homozygous recessive genotypes. And then that can help you as you really work backwards from the offspring to the parents to figure out, well, can we tell for sure if this, for instance, this individual is heterozygous? How do we know he's not homozygous dominant? Well, let's look at his offspring. Well, he has two offspring that are widow peakless. They have no widow's peak, so they must be homozygous recessive. The only way these individuals can be homozygous recessive is if their father gave them a recessive allele. Of course, they got one from mom, but they got one from dad too. All right. So, and of course we know this person as well has to be heterozygous because they have to get that, at least one of their alleles has to be a recessive allele. Okay, so it's really just kind of trial and error. You kind of look through it and you know, most of the time or a lot of time you can figure out if they're homozygous or heterozygous, homozygous dominant or heterozygous, especially if they have children. But you know, sometimes it's difficult and you just put both. You put both genotypes are possible. All right. So I hope that this has helped you better understand this chapter. If you have any questions, please, by all means, let me know and I will help you accordingly.